You ever watch someone break the same thing over and over like the rules just don't apply to them? Like the world is theirs to cut through whenever it's convenient? Because that's exactly what Brenda Whitmore did to my ranch gate at 6:12 every single morning. The crunch of gravel always came first, then the low growl of her oversized SUV engine, and then the sound that made my jaw lock every time. Metal bending, hinges giving, wood splintering just enough to remind me that what my father built with his own hands was being treated like nothing more than an inconvenience. I remember the smell too. Dust kicked up into the dry Texas air, mixing with the faint scent of motor oil from my tools as I stood there gripping a steel wrench so tight my knuckles turned pale, watching her roll through like she owned the place, not even slowing down, not even looking at me. Just one hand on the wheel, and that same smug glance forward like my land was just another shortcut on her morning routine. My name is Ethan Cole, and that gate wasn't just a piece of wood and steel. It was the first thing my dad and I built together on this ranch, 16 feet wide, reinforced posts sunk 4 feet into the ground, designed to last decades, not days. But Brenda had already proven something about herself. She didn't care about boundaries, not legal ones, not physical ones, not even the kind you can see standing right in front of you. At first I thought it was an accident. Maybe she didn't know the road ended there. Maybe she was just confused about property lines. So I fixed the hinges, realigned the posts, even added a fresh coat of paint. But the next morning came the same way: gravel, engine, impact, like a loop that refused to break. By the 4th time I installed a heavier lock. By the 6th, I put up a bright sign that read private property, no trespassing in bold red letters you could see from 50 yards out. And by the 8th time I had already called the county, filed reports, documented everything down to the minute. But nothing stuck, because according to Brenda, that dirt path cutting across my land was a community access route. Words she repeated with that same polished tone. Like saying it enough times would somehow make it true. And every time I tried to reason with her, she'd just smile. That tight, controlled smile that never reached her eyes, and tell me I was obstructing neighborhood flow. Like my property existed to serve her schedule, not mine. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't about a gate anymore. It wasn't about a misunderstanding or a bad habit. This was about control, about someone deciding that if they pushed hard enough, long enough, eventually you'd stop pushing back. So I stopped fixing the gate. I stopped arguing. I stopped reacting altogether. Because while Brenda thought she was wearing me down, I was doing something else entirely. I was measuring distances, checking soil density, reviewing permits, running numbers in my head every night while the ranch went quiet, and the only sound left was the wind brushing across open land. And somewhere between the 9th and the 12th time she drove through that gate, I made a decision that changed everything. I wasn't going to build another gate for her to break. I was going to build something she couldn't even begin to get through. The next morning came quieter, almost too quiet, like the land itself was holding its breath, and I was already awake before the sun broke the horizon, boots on gravel. The cool air carrying that faint metallic scent from the broken hinges still hanging off what used to be my gate. Except this time I did not reach for my tools. I did not measure damage or line up bolts. I just stood there with my hands in my pockets watching the long stretch of dirt road that cut straight toward my property. Because I knew she would come. She always did. Routine was everything to someone like Brenda Whitmore. Routine and control. And right on schedule I heard it again. That distant engine hum growing louder, tires crunching over gravel like clockwork precision. And then she appeared over the rise. Same speed, same confidence, like nothing had changed, like nothing ever would. Except something had, because behind me the ground was no longer soft dust and scattered debris. It was marked, staked, measured down to the inch, bright orange. Survey flags lining the perimeter in a straight line that did not bend, did not compromise. And I watched her eyes flicker just for a second as she got closer. Not confusion, not concern, just that quick calculation people make when they realize something is different but assume it still will not matter. She slowed slightly this time. Not much, maybe 5 miles per hour less than usual, just enough to take in the change. And then she pressed forward anyway, because that is what she does. She pushes, she assumes resistance will give if she leans hard enough. But I had already made the calls, filed the permits, pulled every legal thread available until I had something stronger than a warning sign or a lock. I had authorization, county-approved construction, private boundary reinforcement, every document sitting in a folder on the passenger seat of my truck like quiet insurance. She rolled to a stop about 20 feet from where the gate used to stand, engine idling, window sliding down with that smooth electric hum. And for the first time, she looked directly at me. Really looked, not past me like I was part of the scenery, but at me, her expression tight, controlled, that same polished tone when she spoke, asking what exactly I thought I was doing with all these markings, like I owed her an explanation for protecting what was mine. And I remember the way the morning light hit the dust between us, hanging in the air like a thin veil, and I just nodded once, slow, calm, letting the silence stretch longer than she was comfortable with, because silence has weight when you let it sit. And finally I told her the truth, not raised, not sharp, just steady, that I was done repairing things that were never meant to be broken in the first place. And whatever came next was not something she was going to drive through. She gave that small laugh, the kind that sounds like dismissal wrapped in politeness, said something about community access again, about how this path had been used long before I decided to make it a problem, and then she shifted the car into drive like she always did, like this was just another morning and I was just another obstacle that would move out of the way. But I did not move, and neither did the line behind me, because what she was looking at was not a temporary fix, not another gate she could test. It was the beginning of something permanent, something measured, something designed. And as she eased forward those last few feet, expecting the same outcome she had gotten 11 times before, I could already see the moment forming. The exact second when she would realize that routine only works until someone changes the rules, and I had just changed all of them. She did not stop the way I expected, not fully, just a slow roll forward like she was testing the ground in front of her. Like maybe the rules would bend one more time if she applied just enough pressure, her tires creeping over the gravel until they reached the first line of stakes. And for a second there was this pause, this thin slice of silence where even the wind seemed to pull back, and I could see it in her face. That shift from routine confidence to something tighter, something more calculated, because those markers were not random. They were straight, measured, deliberate, and people like Brenda notice patterns when patterns threaten their control. She stepped out of the vehicle this time, heels pressing into the dirt like she was claiming it with every step, her eyes scanning the flags, the spray-painted lines, the corners marked with precision. And when she looked back at me, there was no smile, just that flat expression people wear when they are trying to decide whether to push harder or change tactics. She asked again what I was building, her tone sharper now, less polished, like the edges were starting to show, and I let the question sit for a moment before answering. Because timing matters when you want someone to understand something without raising your voice. I told her it was a boundary, plain and simple, something that did not move, did not negotiate, something that did not care about shortcuts or convenience. And she let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but did not carry any humor, saying that I could not just block what she called a shared access point, that the community had been using this path for years, that I was going to create problems I could not fix. And I remember tilting my head just slightly, feeling the weight of every early morning crash, every bent hinge, every splintered board, and realizing how strange it was that the only problem she could see was the one that affected her, not the damage she had been causing for weeks, not the fact that she never once asked, never once slowed down, never once treated the space like it belonged to someone else. And that is when I reached into my truck and pulled out the folder, thick with papers, permits stamped, boundaries confirmed, every inch of that land documented down to the decimal. I did not hand it to her right away. I just held it there where she could see it, letting the message land before the details did, because paper carries a different kind of authority, quieter but heavier. And when she finally stepped closer, reaching for it with that same controlled motion she used for everything, I let her take it, watching her eyes move across the pages, watching that confidence try to hold its ground as the reality settled in. This was not a temporary fix, not a reaction. This was planned, approved, inevitable. And the air between us felt different now, less like a standoff and more like a shift, like something had already moved past the point of argument. She closed the folder slowly, handed it back without a word for a second, and then said that this was not over, that the association would have something to say about it, that I was making a mistake, and I just nodded, not agreeing, not arguing, just acknowledging that she needed to say that to hold on to whatever control she thought she still had, because the truth was already set in motion, The ground had been marked, the decisions had been made. And for the first time since this started, I was not reacting to her actions, she was reacting to mine. And as she got back into her vehicle, door closing with that soft mechanical click, engine rising again, I stepped back from the line, boots settling into the dirt behind those markers, knowing exactly what was coming next, because once you draw a line that clear, people like Brenda do not stop. They push harder, they test it, they try to find the weak point. But what she had not realized yet was that there was not going to be one. Not this time. Not anymore. The sound of engines came back before the sun did the next day. But this time it was not just hers. It was heavier, louder, layered with the low rumble of diesel trucks and the steady clank of metal shifting against metal, and I could feel it through the ground before I even stepped outside. Boots hitting the dirt as that early morning chill carried the smell of fresh concrete mix and fuel. Because this was no longer about reacting. This was the build, the part where plans stop living on paper and start taking shape in the real world. I had called in a crew I trusted, men who did not ask questions beyond what mattered, men who understood lines, measurements, permanence, and by the time the first light broke across the ranch, we already had trenches cut along every marked line, 4 feet deep, straight as a ruler, rebar laid in grids that locked everything together like a spine beneath the surface. And I remember crouching down, running my hand along that cold steel, feeling the texture of something that was not meant to bend, not meant to shift, not meant to give way no matter how many times someone decided to test it. The mixer roared to life behind me, that thick grinding sound as concrete churned, the sharp scent of it filling the air. And when the first pour hit the trench, it spread slow and heavy, settling into place with a kind of finality that you do not argue with. And that is when I heard her again, that same engine note cutting through the layered noise of construction. Only this time it did not carry the same confidence. There was hesitation in it, a slight lift off the throttle as she approached, because what had been open land yesterday was now a controlled site. Machines, workers, structure rising out of the ground itself. And she stopped farther back this time, maybe 50 feet out, window lowering as she leaned forward, trying to take it all in, the scope of it, the scale, because this was not a repair, this was not a gate waiting to be replaced, this was something else entirely. I walked over slow, wiping my hands on a cloth that already carried streaks of gray dust, and she asked what I thought I was doing bringing in heavy equipment, her voice cutting sharper now, louder to compete with the machinery. But there was something underneath it, something that sounded like uncertainty, and I told her the truth again, simple, steady, that I was building exactly what the permits allowed, nothing more, nothing less. And she shook her head, stepping out this time, heels sinking slightly into the loose dirt at the edge of the work zone, pointing toward the trench, toward the rebar, saying this was excessive, unnecessary, that no one needed this kind of structure for a simple boundary. And I remember glancing back at the line, at the measurements, at the depth, and thinking about every morning she treated that space like it was optional, like it would always give way. And I told her that simple boundaries had not worked so far, so I was done with simple. The crew kept moving behind me, forms being set, panels being aligned, the rhythm of work steady and focused, and for the first time since this started, she was the one standing still, watching something she could not interrupt, could not reroute, could not ignore. She said the association would file complaints, that they would challenge this, that I was escalating something that did not need to be escalated, and I just nodded again, because I had expected that, planned for that, accounted for every step she might try to take. And as another load of concrete poured into the trench, filling it higher, sealing that line into something solid and permanent, I could see it in her posture, that subtle shift from control to reaction. Because the moment construction begins, the moment something physical starts to rise, the conversation changes. It is no longer about opinions or assumptions. It is about what is already being built. And she stood there for another minute, watching the wall begin where the ground used to be flat, watching the first section take shape, and then she turned back toward her vehicle, slower this time, like she was recalculating everything she thought she understood, because what she was looking at was not something she could drive through tomorrow, or the next day, or any day after that. And the deeper the foundation went, the clearer that truth became. By the third day, the air itself felt different, heavier, like the land had accepted what was happening and settled into it. the constant rhythm of construction replacing the quiet mornings I used to know, and every time the mixer spun or a steel panel locked into place, it echoed across the open acreage with a kind of finality that you could not ignore. The foundation had already cured overnight, solid and unmoving, and now the vertical structure was rising section by section. Reinforced concrete panels guided into position with slow precision, each one 12 feet long, 8 feet tall, edges sealed tight, so there were no gaps, no weak seams, nothing that could be tested or worn down over time. I stood there with my hands resting on my hips, watching the alignment, checking the measurements against the plans in my head, every inch exactly where it needed to be, because this was not just about stopping a vehicle. It was about removing the idea that this space could ever be treated like it was open to interpretation again. And that is when the next move came, not from Brenda directly, but from the system she believed would back her up. A county truck rolled up just past the work zone, tires crunching to a stop as a code enforcement officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, posture straight, expression neutral, the kind of presence meant to slow things down without saying a word. I could feel the crew shift slightly behind me, not stopping, but paying attention, because moments like that can change the direction of everything if you are not ready for them. The officer approached at a measured pace, eyes scanning the site, the trench, the panels already standing, the equipment in motion, and then he looked at me, asking for permits, for documentation, for confirmation that what was happening here was within regulation. And I remember the way the paper felt in my hand when I pulled it from the truck, thick, official, stamped with approvals that were not easy to get but impossible to argue with once they were in place. I handed it over without a word, letting him take the time to read, to verify, to check the details line by line. And while he did that, I noticed her again, Brenda standing farther back this time, near her vehicle, arms crossed, watching like she was waiting for something to go wrong, like she expected the system to step in and undo everything I had set in motion. Her confidence had shifted into something quieter but still present, like she was betting on authority to restore control where her actions had failed. The officer flipped the final page, nodded once, and handed the documents back, saying everything checked out, that the build was within property limits, properly filed, properly approved. And just like that, the moment passed, no interruption, no delay, just a confirmation that what was rising out of that ground was not only physical, but fully backed by the rules she thought she understood better than anyone. I could see it in her posture from across the distance. That small shift again, shoulders tightening, weight shifting from one foot to the other, because that was not the outcome she expected. She turned away before the officer even got back into his truck, moving toward her vehicle with a kind of controlled urgency, like she needed to regroup before anyone saw that something had not gone her way. And behind me the crew kept working, panels locking into place, seams sealed, the wall climbing higher with each passing hour, casting longer shadows across the dirt as the sun moved overhead. And I walked the length of it slowly, running my hand along the surface as it dried, feeling the texture of something that was not temporary, not negotiable, not something that could be worn down by repetition. And for the first time since this started, there was no damage to assess, no repair waiting for me at the end of the day, just progress, steady and irreversible. And as the final panel for that section was lowered into place with a deep, solid thud that echoed across the property, I knew the line had already been crossed, not by her this time, but by me, because once something like this exists, once it stands there in full view, the argument is no longer about what might happen. It is about what already has. By the end of the week, the wall was no longer an idea or a construction site. It was a presence, a solid, uninterrupted line stretching across the edge of my property like it had always been there. The surface still carrying that faint, chalky texture of curing concrete, pale gray under the Texas sun, and the air around it held that distinct scent of dust and stone that lingers after something permanent takes shape. I walked its length early that morning, boots steady against packed dirt, running my hand along the surface again, not checking for flaws this time, but confirming what I already knew. There were none, every joint sealed, every panel aligned, every inch exactly where it was supposed to be, and what used to be an open path was now a clear boundary. No confusion, no interpretation, just a line that did not move. I heard her before I saw her again. That familiar engine sound coming down the road, But it was different now, slower, cautious, like someone approaching something they no longer fully understood. And when her SUV came into view, she did not accelerate like before. She eased forward, inch by inch, eyes locked on the wall rising in front of her. And for the first time since this started, there was no momentum behind her, no assumption that she would pass through like she always had. She stopped a good 30 feet away, engine idling, the low hum filling the silence between us, and I stayed where I was, leaning slightly against the side of my truck, watching without stepping forward. Because this moment was not mine to control anymore. It was hers to understand. She stepped out slowly, closing the door with a softer click than usual. Like even that sound needed to be measured now. Her eyes scanning the height, the thickness, the length of the structure, taking in the full reality of it. And when she finally looked at me, there was no polished smile, no controlled tone, just a direct question, asking if I really thought this was necessary. And I remember letting out a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything that led to this moment settle into something calm, something steady. And I told her the same thing I had been saying all along, just in a different form now, that I was done fixing damage and starting building solutions. And she shook her head slightly, taking a few steps closer to the wall, reaching out to touch the surface like she needed to confirm it was real, her fingers brushing against the concrete. And I could see it in her posture, that realization settling in, not all at once, but in pieces. This was not temporary. This was not something she could challenge with a quick call or a complaint. This was something that would be here tomorrow and the day after and every day after that. She said the association would not accept this, that there would be consequences, that I was making things worse than they needed to be, and I just nodded again, because I had heard it all before. But now the difference was visible, the wall behind me. The line that no longer depended on her choices or mine. It simply existed, and the wind moved across it. Differently, catching along the flat surface instead of sweeping through open land, carrying a low, steady sound that replaced the crashes I used to hear every morning. And she stood there for another minute, looking at the structure, then back at the road behind her, like she was calculating distance, options, outcomes, and finally she turned, walking back to her vehicle without another word. And as she got in and sat there for a moment before putting it into reverse, I realized something I had not felt since this started. There was no anticipation of damage, no expectation of impact, just silence. And as she backed away slowly, tires rolling over gravel in a controlled line instead of cutting through my property, the space between us felt different, not tense, not unresolved, just settled. Because sometimes the only way to stop a pattern is to remove the possibility of it entirely. And that is exactly what I had done. The quiet did not last as long as I expected, not because the wall failed or shifted, but because people like Brenda do not walk away from something like this without trying to take control back another way. And it started with paper, not noise, a thick envelope left at the edge of my driveway early one morning, the kind of certified mail that feels heavier than it should when you pick it up, the official seal stamped across the front like it carried more authority than it actually did. I opened it standing right there in the gravel, the sun barely up, and inside was exactly what I knew was coming. A formal notice from the Homeowners Association, claims about obstruction, about disrupting what they called established access, about violations that somehow ignored the fact that the land they were talking about had never belonged to them in the first place. I read every line slowly, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to push the narrative, and it was all there. The language polished, the tone confident, the assumption that pressure would work the same way it always had. But something about it felt different this time, not stronger, just louder, like they were trying to make up for the fact that the physical reality standing behind me could not be argued away. I folded the paper once, clean and precise, and slid it back into the envelope before walking toward my truck. Because this part did not require reaction, it required preparation. I had already spoken with a property attorney 2 days before the final panel went up, someone who specialized in boundary disputes, someone who understood that documentation is not just protection, it is leverage. And by mid-morning I was sitting across from him in a quiet office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, laying out every detail, every report, every permit, every photograph I had taken since the first time that gate was broken. He did not interrupt much, just nodded, flipping through the pages with a kind of calm focus that told me he had seen situations like this before. And when he finally spoke, it was simple, direct, saying that everything I had done was not only legal but necessary given the pattern of trespass, that their claims would not hold if challenged properly, and that if anything they were the ones stepping into territory they could not defend. I remember leaning back in that chair, feeling something settle into place, not relief exactly, more like confirmation that the line I had drawn was solid in more ways than one. And when I got back to the ranch later that afternoon, the wall cast a long shadow across the dirt, stretching farther than it had the day before as the sun dipped lower, and I could see her again in the distance, standing near the road, not approaching this time, just watching, like she was trying to figure out where the next move was supposed to come from. But this was not her kind of ground anymore. This was not something she could drive through or talk over or pressure into changing. This was documentation, law, structure, all aligned in a way that did not leave space for interpretation. And as the wind moved across the surface of that wall, carrying that low, steady sound that had replaced the chaos of before, I realized something else had changed too. It was no longer about stopping her actions. It was about letting her realize there was nothing left to act on, and the more she tried to push through channels that did not belong to her, the clearer that truth was going to become, because some lines you draw with wood and metal, and some you draw with paper and time. But when you line them up together, there is not much anyone can do to cross them. The response did not take long to come, but it did not arrive the way it used to, not with engines or shortcuts or early morning routines. It came through official channels, scheduled, structured, the kind of confrontation that happens in rooms where words carry more weight than actions. And 2 days later, I found myself sitting at a long conference table inside a county mediation office, the air cool, almost sterile, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead replacing the open silence of the ranch. And across from me sat Brenda Whitmore, posture straight, expression carefully composed, flanked by 2 members of the Homeowners Association board and their legal representative, a man with a neat stack of documents in front of him and a tone that suggested confidence built on assumption rather than fact. I placed my own folder on the table, not opening it yet, just letting it rest there, because timing still mattered even here. The mediator began with formalities, outlining the purpose of the meeting, the claims being made, obstruction, interference, disruption of what they continued to call a shared access route. And I listened without interrupting, watching Brenda more than anything else. The way her fingers rested lightly on the table, the way her gaze stayed forward, controlled, like she believed this setting would restore the balance she had lost out there on the dirt road. Their attorney spoke next, outlining their position in polished language, referencing usage patterns, community expectations, and implied access rights, building a case that sounded structured but lacked something solid beneath it. And when he finished, there was a brief pause, that same kind of silence I had learned to use, the kind that lets the weight of reality settle in before anyone tries to move past it. I opened my folder slowly, sliding the documents forward one by one: property surveys, recorded deeds, county permits, photographs with timestamps, every instance documented, every line clearly defined. And I spoke without raising my voice, explaining that what they called shared access had never been established legally, that repeated use without permission did not create ownership, that every attempt I made to address the issue before construction had been ignored, and that the structure now standing was not an escalation but a response grounded entirely within my rights as the property owner. The mediator leaned forward slightly, reviewing the documents, asking a few precise questions, and I answered each one directly. No hesitation, no need to search for anything beyond what was already laid out in front of us. And I could see the shift happen in real time, subtle but undeniable. The attorney across the table adjusting his posture, flipping through his notes again, Brenda's expression tightening just slightly. Because this was no longer about narrative, it was about evidence. And evidence does not bend the way assumptions do. The mediator eventually leaned back, hands folded, and summarized the situation in clear terms, stating that there was no legal basis for enforced access across private land without formal easements, that the construction complied with county regulations, and that any further dispute would likely not favor the association if pursued in court. The room went quiet after that, not tense, just settled, like something had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be pushed any further. Brenda did not respond right away. Her gaze fixed on the table for a moment before she finally looked up, and there was no argument left in it. No push, just a measured acceptance that the outcome was not what she had expected. The meeting ended without resolution in their favor, without any agreement to remove or alter what had been built. And as I walked out into the afternoon light, the air warmer, carrying that familiar scent of dry earth and open space, I realized that the shift had completed itself. What started as something she could ignore had turned into something she could not move. Not physically, not legally, not at all. The ranch felt different after that meeting, not louder, not quieter, just settled in a way I had not experienced since before any of this started, the kind of calm that does not come from silence, but from knowing there is nothing left to fix, nothing left to brace for. I walked out along the wall that evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dirt, the surface of the concrete still holding warmth from the day, and the wind moved across it with that steady, low sound that had replaced the sharp crashes I used to hear every morning. And for the first time in weeks, there was no anticipation attached to that hour, no waiting for an engine to break the quiet, no tension in my shoulders as I listened for something out of place, just the open stretch of land behind me and a boundary that did exactly what it was built to do. I remember stopping near the center of the wall, looking out toward the road where she used to come through without slowing down, and it struck me how much had changed without anything actually moving anymore. Because that was the point. The motion had stopped, not by force, not by argument, but by design, and a few days passed without seeing her at all. No early morning drive, no car parked at a distance, no presence watching from the edge of the property, just empty road and open sky. And then one afternoon I saw it. Not her, but the shift, a new set of gravel tracks forming farther down the road, curving away from my boundary, cutting through a different stretch of land that did not belong to me. A longer route, less convenient, but one that did not cross a line she could no longer ignore. And I stood there watching those tracks for a moment, the shape of them clear against the dust, and realized that this was the outcome she had been avoiding from the start. Not the wall itself, but the need to change, to adjust, to accept that the path she had taken for granted was never hers to begin with. And later that evening, as the sky turned a deep orange and the air cooled just enough to carry the scent of dry grass and distant trees, I sat on the tailgate of my truck with that same folder resting beside me, unopened now, not because it was no longer important, but because it had already done its job. The proof had been laid out, the line had been drawn, and there was nothing left to argue about. And I thought about all the mornings I had spent fixing that gate, tightening bolts, replacing boards, convincing myself that the next repair would be the last, that eventually the pattern would stop on its own. But it never does. Not until you change something fundamental. Not until you stop reacting and start building something that does not depend on anyone else's choices. And as the light faded and the wall blended into the landscape, becoming part of it instead of standing out against it, I understood something my father used to say when we first built that gate years ago, that a boundary is not about keeping people out. It is about defining what is yours clearly enough that no one can pretend they did not know. And standing there now, with no sound of impact, no dust rising from broken wood, just the steady presence of something that would not move, I realized the difference between repairing a problem and ending it, because one keeps you in the cycle and the other steps out of it entirely. And the next morning came the same way it always had, quiet, open, untouched, except this time there was nothing coming down that road. No engine, no routine, just the kind of stillness that tells you the situation is not waiting to repeat itself anymore. It is finished.